To quickly demonstrate to you the iteration control in C. There are two iteration controls that you need to know or that you're going to learn in this video, and the first one is called the while iteration control. And the while iteration control has a flow diagram that's indicated here. You can see the first thing that is done is a condition is evaluated, and this is either an equality check, or it is a greater than less than check, or it can also just be a number. So this condition, if it's a 0, it'll just drop out. However, if it's a non-zero, if this condition returns non-zero, it means that the condition evaluated as true. It performs certain functions and then jumps back and does the evaluation again. And I've written some code here. You can see in this code I have an integer counter. This counter I initially set equal to a value of 0, and then inside the while, this while is a keyword, which means it's going to iterate, and inside the while condition I have counter is less than or equal to 3. So when the while enters, the first thing that is done is that condition is evaluated. You can see that on the first pass, counter will be equal to 0. So this whole thing will be evaluated as 0 is less than 3, and because this is true, that whole thing results in 1 just for the instance, or for that instant, and because that is 1, it will do the next line of code and then re-evaluate the condition as is indicated here. Do the line of code, re-evaluate the condition. But because we have a block of code, it will do the whole block of code, and only then will it re-evaluate the condition here. So on the first pass, as I said, it'll be true, so it'll enter into this loop and it'll print out the counter is equal to, print out the value of counter, and then I've just added a line of code to demonstrate that it's not a single line of code that it's going to execute. And then finally we have here a counter that's incremented. This isn't necessarily part of the while loop, but if you're doing counter control while loop, then you would like to change some kind of a counter or a variable which you have in your condition to terminate the while loop. Otherwise you might end up with an infinitive loop. So counter is incremented. When it reaches the end of the while loop, it jumps back into the condition, checks the condition. If it's true, it will do the whole thing again. If it's false, however, it'll start with this line of code here, there, as it exits the while loop. So if I run this code, I just want to show you what it does. You can see counter is 0, some line of code, counter is 1, some line of code, etc. And I'm just going to run the debugger to show you how that steps through it as well. So what you can see is that if I run the debugger, you can see it steps. Now the counter value was 0. It's type integer, and then the first thing the while does is it evaluates that condition. Because it's true, you can actually hover above counter here. You can see its value at the moment is 0. Because it's true, it enters into this while loop, performs that line of code, increments counter, and as soon as it's incremented counter becomes 1. Now it jumps back into this while condition check the condition. At the moment counter is 1, which is less than 3, so this whole thing will again evaluate as 1 because it's true. If it was false, it would have evaluated as 0 and go into the loop as follows. So as you can see now, the value of 3 or of a counter is 3, so it's still true because it's less than or equal to 3. And then finally here counter becomes 4. When counter is 4, you can see it's 4 now, then this will be false, so the whole thing will result in a 1 and in a 0, and because that's false, it'll jump out. It doesn't enter the loop again. So the only thing I want to show you in addition to this is what the for loop looks like. So the for loop is also an iterative control, but the difference is the for loop is a nice and packaged format of doing a while loop. So the easiest way to explain this, I guess, would be to do that. if I do that, I've done no changes to the code. Functionally, it'll still perform exactly the same, I hope. Let's just see what I've done. Permission denied. Let me just kill that debugging function. There we go. And okay, that thread is dead. There we go. So it's doing exactly the same. I've done nothing. So that is exactly equivalent to the while I had previously. But what the for does is it gives you the ability to just write it in a neat way, because when you work with counter-controlled while loops, you always, or almost always, have this initialization or assigning to an initial value, and then you also almost always have some kind of an increment. So the for loop allows you to just move that one in there, and it allows you to move that in there, and that still does exactly. Oh, sorry, I just need to remove that semicolon there. Separated by semicolons, you have your initialization, you have your condition, and you have your increment. And that should do exactly the same. There we go. So this is done only once, and is as if it's written here. By the way, note that you have to declare your variable beforehand. You're not supposed to do that. That's wrong, at least in C. And then the increment here is written here, but it's as if it's performed immediately when it reaches that brace down there. So every time the loop the loop finishes at the end, then counter is incremented, or whatever you've written here is performed, and then this condition is performed. So if we just run this code quickly, I'm just going to debug that as well. As I step through the code, you will see initially the counter value is some random value which was stored in memory. But if I then step one step, you can see counter is made 0 immediately. The condition is evaluated as true, and then it jumps into this block of code, does the first line, does the second line, and then it jumps back. And what you may have missed is counter is incremented by 1 as well. So the first thing that's done is counter is incremented, that's when it reaches the end. Counter is incremented, then the condition is checked again, and this is not done again. This is only done for the first time the for loop runs. So first increment, then condition check, and then run the rest of the code. And it does exactly that all the time through until that condition is false. When it's evaluated, it drops out and continues with the rest of the code. Just so that you can see the flow diagram of that as well. This is the for loop flow diagram. You can see there's some instruction which we call the initialization of the for loop. You can leave it empty, as I did with the conversion from while to for, and you can after that you have your condition, and inside that condition you basically just check, should this for loop do another iteration, should it do one more loop. And initially it does a check. If the check fails, it doesn't even do it once. Then you have some instructions. If it's true, it performs those instructions, and then it does the increment before checking the counter, or at least the condition again. And as I said, this condition can be anything, an equality, a greater than, less than, or it can just be a number. If it's 0, it won't do the loop. If it's a non-zero value, it'll do the loop.